Food preservation is essential to human civilization. If we can't keep food fresh for longer periods, we all starve when seasons change or crops fail. But even more important than the foods we eat today is how they got that way. Because there are many ways to preserve food, but only a few of them make the food actually edible. Hi, I'm here to answer the great questions of the universe. Like, why do we eat corn dogs? Why is cheese sometimes smelly? And how do we stop food from going bad? To find out how food went from something that spoils to something that lasts forever, let's go back to the beginning. Salt has been used to preserve meat since as early as 2000 BCE. Some think that the use of salt to preserve meat was discovered accidentally by someone who salted their food too much and then didn't eat it right away. When they came back to it, the salty, preserved meat tasted pretty good. In fact, many believe that the origin of salt comes from people harvesting the stuff naturally occurring in salty lakes and marshes. They probably discovered that if they left meat out in the sun but mixed in some of that salty water, the meat stayed fresh longer and became quite tasty. This technique is known as the salt cure, and it works thanks to salt's ability to dehydrate things. Salt is made up of sodium and chloride ions, and both have the ability to cross cell membranes, which is the skin or outside layer of bacteria cells. Once inside, they disrupt the way the cell works by messing with things like pH levels and water balance. With the help of osmosis, salt moves from areas of high salt concentration, like your food, to areas of low salt concentration, like inside bacterial cells. It's kind of like pouring salt water into a glass of water. The water moves from the cup into the salt until the salt concentration is equal on both sides of the membrane. By removing water from bacteria, salt inhibits their growth and stops them from spoiling your food. Plus, it also really makes foods last a lot longer. Studies show that salt can extend the shelf life of bacon by over 2 years. That's why it's often called a dry cure, because salt removes so much moisture that bacteria cannot survive. Salt also enhances the flavor of food, which makes it taste delicious. So it not only helps us preserve food, but it makes preserved food taste better too. This has led to some interesting side effects, though. For example, societies that consumed lots of salt-cured meats had a craving for sour things. Sauerkraut was created by German peasants to accompany salt pork during World War II, and the word sauerkraut literally means sour, stuff. And while ancient Romans were eating salad fish, which was cured in vinegar or brine, modern-day Filipinos are eating fish that's cured in vinegar and salt, called sinigang na baboy, which translates to sour pork soup. The sourness comes from acetic acid, which is produced when bacteria convert acetic acid into carbon dioxide. But wait a minute, we just talked about how salt keeps food from going bad, because it kills bacteria. That depends on what type of bacteria you're talking about. There are tons of different types of bacteria in the world, and each one has its own optimal environment for growth. One type of bacteria, called lactic acid bacteria, or LAB for short, thrive in salty environments. So instead of killing off this particular bacteria, salt encourages its growth. And this has a huge impact on how we preserve food. See, once those lactic acid bacteria start growing, they convert the sugars in food into lactic acid. Lactic acid is a mild acid, but it's strong enough to stop most other bacteria and fungi from growing. The process is called lactic acid fermentation. It's what's responsible for the tangy flavor in yogurt and sauerkraut, the bubbles in kimchi, and it's also what gives champagne its signature fizziness. In fact, people have been using lactic acid fermentation for thousands of years to preserve vegetables. Around 5000 BCE, Chinese people were fermenting vegetables like cabbage and chilies. And over 4,000 miles away, people in Mesopotamia were doing the same thing. It may seem crazy that such similar techniques developed independently in such distant places. But it makes sense when you consider that the ability to preserve food was vital for humans. And fermentation was one of the first techniques that allowed us to do that. This discovery had a profound effect on the course of human history. Instead of having to constantly grow new crops, humans could store food from the previous harvest, freeing them to pursue other activities. No wonder we still use fermentation today to preserve everything from beer to kimchi to kombucha. Now, salt and fermentation weren't the only ancient techniques people used to preserve food. People would smoke their food, dry it, pickle it, even encase it in beeswax. These methods remove water from food, making it hard for bacteria to grow. Of course, certain foods like dried meat are just better suited for long-term storage than others, like fresh fruit. Fresh fruit is full of water, so it's hard to keep it fresh for a long time. But there was an invention that was about to change everything. Sugar. Before sugar, honey was the sweetener of choice, and it did a decent job at preserving things, but it couldn't do much on its own. It took a trip to India to get the real deal started. When sugarcane arrived in Europe in the Middle Ages, it spread like wildfire. The reason for its popularity is pretty obvious. Unlike salt, sugar doesn't taste gross. Unlike honey, it's cheap. Quickly, every jam maker and baker was using it to preserve fruit. The intense sweetness creates an environment where very few bacteria can survive, and as a bonus, it tastes amazing. The combination of the two allowed humanity to move on from just preserving vegetables and meats to preserving fruits and dairy products. 2. It gave rise to the global dessert industry. And without sugar, your favorite candies wouldn't exist. And there's a lot of other foods that rely on sugar too. For example, fruitcake has a whopping 40% of its weight in sugar, and that's exactly why it lasts for so long. In fact, they've been found perfectly preserved in ancient Egyptian tombs. However, it isn't all good news. The quest for sugar-fueled slavery and colonialism across the world, including the transatlantic slave trade. So it's important to understand the downsides of this tasty treat. During the Middle Ages, people were also curing and smoking foods in interesting ways. Now we know that salt preserves food by removing water, so it makes sense that brining food in salty water is a good way to preserve it. But they took it one step further by putting saltpeter, or potassium nitrate, into their salt cures. Saltpeter was originally used to purify water, but scientists soon realized that it helped make salt last longer, and it made meat stay fresh for even longer. That's because saltpeter prevents bacteria from producing toxins by interfering with their enzymes. But that's not all it does. It also contributes to the pink color of processed meats like ham, and by adding certain wood chips to the brine, they were able to infuse their meats with incredible flavors. Nowadays, we use hickory, cherry, and apple wood to smoke our barbecue, but during the Middle Ages, people were smoking meats with fruit pits and grains. For example, sawdust from apple trees, cherry pits, maple and hickory nuts, and sawdust from the black locust tree. These days, we add sawdust to our barbecues for a special smoky flavor, but historically, it was just something they had on hand. And while we think of smoking as a way to preserve meat, back then it was mostly used for flavor and to make meat look appealing. Then came spices. People began using spices to mask the taste and smell of spoilage, so that it looked and tasted okay. Pepper was particularly useful because it numbs your mouth, so you don't taste anything funky, and cinnamon covers up unpleasant smells really well too. Most people think that spices were used only for their flavor, but they were also used to make spoiled foods seem fresh. In the 19th century, people's understanding of microbiology and chemistry started developing and people began uncovering the secrets of life. Then in 1862, Louis Pasteur changed the world by discovering how to pasteurize milk. He found that heating milk to 55 degrees Celsius for 30 minutes killed off harmful bacteria without changing its flavor. His discovery revolutionized the food industry and saved countless lives. Around the same time, people figured out how to seal foods in airtight jars and heat them up. And in 1858, French inventor Nicolas Appert received a patent for sealing foods in jars. Then 30 years later, another scientist named John Hall invented a machine that could seal lids onto jars with a special technique called the double seam process. This invention was called canning. In order to kill harmful bacteria and preserve food, cans needed to be sealed tightly and heated. And after that, they stayed fresh almost indefinitely. This was a major breakthrough for food preservation. All of a sudden, canned foods were everywhere. And finally, people had a safe way to preserve fruits. In 1864, a man named Ezra Daggett patented a can sealer that could quickly seal and heat cans. And just 2 years later, the first commercial cannery opened in the U.S. while canning tomatoes. During World War II, the government wanted to ensure soldiers had access to nutritious meals, so they began giving them canned fruits and vegetables. Today, we can buy nearly any food in a can, although some might argue that they don't taste as good as fresh. But canning allows farmers to sell their produce year-round, and it makes food accessible to everyone, no matter where you live. Canning was great, but it required people to heat their food to super high temperatures. Enter refrigeration, which made food preservation easier than ever before. In 1805, a French physicist discovered that cooling something down causes the amount of gas dissolved in a liquid to increase. This meant that if you put beer in a closed container and cooled it down, the pressure would increase and eventually the bottle would explode. Although that's pretty dangerous. American inventor Jacob Perkins applied this principle to refrigeration in 1834 when he created the first vapor compression refrigerator. In 1913, the first electric refrigerator was sold to the public, and the rest is history. Nowadays, almost everybody has a fridge. And while they aren't as exciting as other inventions, we wouldn't be able to survive without them. And that brings us to freeze drying. This process involves freezing food, then placing it in a vacuum chamber. The vacuum removes the water from the frozen food without turning it into mush. This way you can store food for decades, and it's been used to send food into space. Freeze drying is a relatively recent innovation, but it seems like it could be the future of food preservation. Other innovative techniques like irradiation and pulsed electric fields are being explored as potential ways to safely preserve food. Irradiation uses ionizing radiation like X-rays to kill harmful bacteria. Pulsed electric fields deliver an electrical charge to food to destroy microorganisms. So, who knows? Maybe someday we won't need refrigerators or freezers. Thanks for watching this episode, which was brought to you with the help of our patrons. If you'd like to help us make more videos about the secret history of everyday things, you can go to our support page.